The rain fell like a judgment over Manhattan, each droplet tracing the glass of the penthouse window as if trying to wash away sins that had long since calcified into the steel bones of the city. Elena Morrison stood in the amber glow of the floor lamp, her reflection fractured by rivulets of water, a ghost of the woman she'd been 3 years ago when she'd said "I do" to a man who viewed marriage as another hostile takeover. Her suitcase lay open on the bed, half packed, half abandoned, a physical manifestation of the liminal space she now occupied between staying and leaving. The apartment smelled of expensive minimalism, leather, white oak, and the faint metallic tang of ambition. It was a space designed to impress, not to hold love. Every corner reminded her that she had been an accessory to Marcus's empire, never its heart. Marcus Thorne. Even his name carried the weight of boardrooms and mergers, of quarterly earnings and calculated risks. She'd met him at a charity gala 6 years ago, back when she still believed that intelligence and intensity could be mistaken for depth. He'd been magnetic then, sharp-suited, eloquent, his attention so focused it felt like sunlight through a magnifying glass. She'd thought she was special. She'd thought she'd seen something in him that others missed. How naive she'd been. Elena moved to the mahogany desk that dominated one wall of their bedroom, her fingers trembling as she began sorting through the papers she'd need for the divorce attorney. Bank statements, property deeds, the prenuptial agreement she'd signed with stars in her eyes and trust in her heart. But as she opened the bottom drawer, the one Marcus kept locked, the one whose key she'd found months ago but never had the courage to use, she discovered something that would shatter not just her marriage, but her understanding of the man she'd slept beside. The manila folder was unmarked, innocuous. Inside, a contract dated 8 months ago, printed on letterhead she didn't recognize. GeneTech Solutions International. Her eyes skimmed the legalese, stumbling over phrases that seemed pulled from a dystopian novel. Genetic material procurement. Embryonic transfer agreement. Compensation upon successful viability. And there, in Marcus's precise signature, the date. February 14th. Valentine's Day. The same day he'd come home late from a business dinner and touched her with what she'd mistaken for passion, but now recognized as calculation. The same night that had resulted in the 2 pink lines she'd stared at this morning, alone in the bathroom while Marcus was already at the office before dawn. Her legs gave out. She sank to the floor, the contract clutched in her hands, and understood with horrifying clarity that she hadn't just been a wife. She'd been a means of production, an incubator for a product he'd already sold. The philosophical weight of it crushed her. What did it mean to be human in a world where children could be commodified before they were even conceived? Where love was just another transaction, and the most intimate act of creation could be reduced to a line item in a contract? She thought of her grandmother, who used to say that a person's worth was measured not in what they accumulated, but in what they gave freely. Marcus had accumulated everything, wealth, power, respect, but he'd never given anything that wasn't transactional. Even this child, this potential life growing inside her, had been part of a negotiation she'd never known existed. The rain intensified, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Hudson River like God clearing his throat before pronouncing judgment. Elena didn't remember standing, but she found herself in the kitchen, the contract spread across the marble island like evidence at a crime scene. The apartment's silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the sub-zero refrigerator and her own ragged breathing. She'd read the document 3 times now, each pass revealing new horrors. GeneTech Solutions International wasn't just any biotech firm. A quick search on her phone revealed it was a subsidiary of a larger conglomerate specializing in genetic optimization services for wealthy clients unable to conceive naturally. They didn't advertise publicly, operating instead through referrals among the ultra-rich, offering designer pregnancies with carefully selected genetic profiles. Marcus had sold their embryo, or rather, the embryo they would create, to a couple in Singapore. Industrialists named Wei who'd paid $3 million for guaranteed delivery. The contract stipulated that Elena would carry the child to term, that custody would be transferred immediately upon birth, and that she would sign away all parental rights in exchange for nothing. She would receive nothing. The $3 million went entirely to Marcus. Her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, still flat, still showing no sign of the cellular division occurring within. 2 weeks pregnant, maybe 3. The blood test she'd taken yesterday at the clinic had been definitive, and she'd planned to tell Marcus tonight over the dinner reservation she'd made at that French restaurant he liked, the one where the waiters treated him like visiting royalty. She'd imagined his face softening. Imagined him putting down his phone for once, reaching across the table to take her hand, maybe even smiling with something other than the calculated expression he used in contract negotiations. She'd let herself believe that a child might be the bridge back to the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who'd quoted Rilke on their 3rd date and talked about building something meaningful, not just profitable. But Marcus had never been that man. Or perhaps he had been, once, before success had alchemized his humanity into something harder and more valuable in the markets of Manhattan. The sound of the elevator arriving at their private floor sent ice through her veins. He was home early, unprecedented for a Tuesday. She heard his key in the lock, the heavy tread of his Italian leather shoes on the hardwood, the rustle of his coat being shed. Elena? His voice carried its usual note of distraction, as if even calling her name was an interruption to more important thoughts. Why are the lights on in the bedroom? Are you going somewhere? She stood frozen, the contract in her hands, and realized she was facing the first truly consequential decision of her adult life. She could confront him now, with the evidence literally in hand, and watch whatever remained of their marriage explode like a controlled demolition. Or she could hide the document, play ignorant, and buy herself time to think, to plan, to understand the full scope of what he'd done. But even as she considered her options, Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, and his eyes, those cold, analytical eyes that had once seemed so intelligent, locked onto the papers she held. For 3 seconds, neither of them moved. In the crystalline silence, Elena understood that everything she said next would determine not just her future, but the future of the child she carried. The child Marcus had already sold like a commodity, like shares in a company, like anything else that could be reduced to its market value. What is this? She was surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, the way it didn't shake despite the tremor in her hands. What the hell is this, Marcus? He didn't flinch. Didn't rush to explain or deny. Instead, he set down his briefcase with deliberate care, loosened his tie, and met her gaze with something that might have been resignation, or might have been relief that the secret was finally out. It's a business arrangement, he said, as if that explained everything, as if those 3 words could somehow justify the unfathomable. One that would have benefited both of us significantly if you hadn't gone snooping through my private files. The casualness of his tone, the absolute lack of shame or acknowledgement of wrongdoing, struck her like a physical blow. This was who he truly was, a man who saw no distinction between negotiating a merger and selling their unborn child, a man for whom ethics were simply another form of inefficiency. Benefited both of us? Elena's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. You sold our baby, Marcus. Our child. You sold them before they were even conceived, before I even knew I was pregnant, and you didn't think to mention it? You weren't pregnant when I signed the contract, he countered, moving to pour himself a scotch from the bar cart, his movements precise and unhurried. It was a hypothetical arrangement, an opportunity that wouldn't wait for sentimentality. I'm pregnant now. The words came out like a confession, like an accusation. 2 weeks, maybe 3. I found out yesterday. For the first time, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation, or some emotion she could no longer read in a man who'd become a stranger. He took a long drink of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of decisions already made. Then the contract is now active, he said. The Weiss will be informed and will proceed according to the terms. You'll receive the best prenatal care money can buy, and in 7 months, we'll complete the transaction as agreed. Elena felt the floor shift beneath her feet, felt reality rearrange itself into something unrecognizable. He wasn't apologizing, wasn't even pretending this was anything other than a done deal. He expected her to comply, to carry a child for 9 months, knowing they'd be taken from her the moment they drew their first breath. No, she said, and the word felt like the first honest thing she'd said in years. No, Marcus. I won't do this. I'm calling a lawyer. I'm calling the police. This has to be illegal. It's not. He set down his glass with a soft click. I had the best attorneys in the city review every clause. The contract is ironclad. You have no legal standing to object because technically you're not a party to the agreement. I am. And in New York State, I have the legal right to make decisions regarding our conjugal assets. Our baby is not an asset. The words came out as a whisper, as a prayer, as a desperate attempt to remind him of something he'd clearly forgotten. They're a human being, our child. Not yet, Marcus said, and in those 2 words, Elena heard the full extent of his moral bankruptcy. Right now, they're a cluster of cells with potential value. And I've already secured that value in a way that will set us up for the rest of our lives. The Weiss are paying $3 million, Elena. Do you understand what that means? What we could do with that kind of capital? She understood perfectly. She understood that she'd married a man capable of reducing life itself to a financial instrument. A man who saw their child, their possible child, their hoped-for child, as nothing more than inventory to be liquidated. Outside, the storm intensified, and Elena made a decision that would change everything. She set the contract down on the marble island, met her husband's eyes, and spoke with a clarity born of finally seeing the truth. I want a divorce, she said, and I'm keeping this baby. The silence that followed her declaration felt apocalyptic, as if the words themselves had torn a hole in the fabric of their carefully constructed life. Marcus stood motionless, his hand still resting on the glass of scotch, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally settling on something cold and calculating. You can't, he said simply. The contract? I don't care about the contract. Elena surprised herself with her own certainty. You signed it without my knowledge or consent. You negotiated the sale of a child we hadn't even conceived yet. No court in the country would uphold that, Marcus. No judge would force a woman to give up her baby under these circumstances. You'd be surprised what courts will uphold when enough money is involved. His voice had taken on the tone he used in boardroom battles, cold and strategic. The Weiss have already transferred the first $1 million as a deposit. If we breach this contract, we're liable for triple damages plus legal fees. We're talking $9 million, Elena. Can you afford that? Because I certainly won't pay it to protect your sudden maternal instincts. She felt the trap closing around her. Of course, Marcus had structured it this way. He structured everything to insulate himself from risk while maximizing leverage. Even now, facing the collapse of his marriage, he was calculating angles, assessing positions, planning his next move. But Elena had spent 3 years watching him operate. She'd learned something about strategy, too, even if she'd never wanted to use it against her own husband. "If I keep this baby," she said slowly, thinking through each word, "the contract becomes void because you can't deliver the product. The Weiss will sue you for breach. And when it comes out in court why you breached because you tried to sell a human being without the mother's consent, your reputation will be destroyed. Genetech will drop you to avoid the scandal. Every business partner you have will distance themselves. You'll be toxic." She watched this calculus register on his face, watched him run the numbers, and realize she was right. Marcus Thorne had built his empire on reputation, on being the man who always delivered, who never showed weakness, who operated within the bounds of law even when those bounds were unconscionably wide. A scandal like this would end him. "So that's it?" His voice carried an edge of something she'd never heard before. Fear, maybe, or respect. "You'd blow up my life, cost me $9 million, and destroy everything I've built just to keep a child you didn't even know you wanted until an hour ago?" "Yes," Elena said, and felt the truth of it settle in her bones. "Because this isn't about wanting or not wanting. It's about what's right. You can't sell human beings, Marcus. You can't commodify life itself. And if you can't understand that, then I was right to leave." She moved toward the bedroom, toward her half-packed suitcase, and he didn't try to stop her. But his voice followed her through the doorway, laden with a finality that matched her own. "If you walk out that door, I'll fight this with everything I have. I'll use every legal loophole, every technicality, every advantage. I won't let you destroy me." Elena paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame, and looked back at the man she'd married. In the amber light of the kitchen, he looked smaller somehow, diminished not by her leaving, but by the full revelation of who he'd always been. She felt a wave of something that wasn't quite pity, but wasn't quite contempt either. A profound sadness for what he'd become, what he'd perhaps always been beneath the charm and intensity. "Then I guess we'll both do what we have to do," she said. "But Marcus, I'm not trying to destroy you. I'm trying to save the person I used to be, the person who believed in things that mattered more than money." She turned away before he could respond, before she could see whatever flicker of humanity might or might not appear on his face. Her hands shook as she finished packing, throwing clothes into the suitcase with none of the care she'd used earlier. She grabbed her laptop, her phone charger, the small wooden box her grandmother had left her. The things that mattered, the things that were truly hers. As she wheeled her suitcase toward the elevator, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, her hair disheveled from running her hands through it. She looked like someone who'd survived a natural disaster, which in a way she had. The earthquake of realizing your whole life had been built on a fault line. But beneath the exhaustion and fear, she saw something else: determination. A fierce, protective instinct that she'd never felt before, that rose from somewhere deep and primal. This child growing inside her was real, was hers, was worth fighting for, worth risking everything for. The elevator doors opened, and Elena stepped inside without looking back. As the car descended 30 floors to street level, she felt the weight of decision settling over her shoulders. She had no plan, no clear path forward. She had a divorce to file, a contract to fight, a CEO who would use every weapon in his considerable arsenal to force her compliance. But she also had something Marcus had lost long ago, if he'd ever possessed it at all. A moral center that wouldn't bend, a line she wouldn't cross, a belief that some things, some precious, sacred things, could never be reduced to their market value. The elevator reached the ground floor, and the doors opened onto the marble lobby of the building that had been her home, but never her sanctuary. The doorman looked up in surprise as she emerged with her suitcase, his expression shifting to concern as he took in her appearance. "Mrs. Thorne? Is everything all right? Should I call you a car?" "Yes," Elena said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Please. And actually, it's Ms. Morrison now, or it will be soon." As she waited for the car, standing in the warm, amber light of the lobby while the storm raged outside, Elena Morrison placed her hand over her stomach and made a silent promise to the child she carried. She didn't know how she would keep them safe, didn't know what battles lay ahead, didn't know if she was strong enough to win against a man with Marcus's resources and ruthlessness. But she knew she would try. She would fight with everything she had, would stand against the machinery of commerce and contract law that sought to reduce humanity to commodity. She would be the line between what was legal and what was right, between what was profitable and what was sacred. The car pulled up, sleek and black in the rain, and Elena stepped out into the storm. As the driver loaded her suitcase, she looked up at the penthouse 30 floors above, at the windows glowing like cold eyes in the darkness. Marcus would be up there now, making calls, rallying his attorneys, preparing for war. Let him come, she thought. Let him bring everything he has. She was fighting for something he would never understand, something that couldn't be bought or sold or negotiated in a boardroom. She was fighting for love in a world that had forgotten what the word meant. And as the car pulled away from the curb, carrying her toward an uncertain future, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years of marriage: hope. Elena spent her first night of freedom in a boutique hotel in Brooklyn, the kind of place that prided itself on exposed brick and reclaimed wood, on being authentic in a city that increasingly valued only the appearance of authenticity. She lay awake most of the night, her hand resting on her stomach, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a neighborhood that wasn't insulated by 30 floors of steel and glass. Around 3 in the morning, she finally slept and dreamed of her grandmother's house in Vermont, the kitchen with its checkered tablecloth, the garden where wildflowers grew in deliberate chaos, the porch swing where they'd sit on summer evenings while her grandmother told stories about choosing integrity over convenience, about standing firm when the world pushed you to bend. She woke to sunlight streaming through the gauze curtains and 17 missed calls from Marcus. She didn't listen to the voicemails. Instead, she contacted Sarah Chen, a family law attorney she'd met at a fundraiser 2 years ago, someone who'd once told Elena that if she ever needed help, the offer stood. Sarah's office was in Tribeca, a converted loft with plants in every corner and photographs of her 2 daughters on the desk. She listened to Elena's story without interruption, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to genuine alarm as the details emerged. "This is unprecedented," Sarah said when Elena finished, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "I've seen prenuptial agreements that commodify assets, custody arrangements that treat children like property to be divided, but I've never seen anything quite like this. A contract to sell an unconceived child to third parties? It's either brilliantly legal or monstrously illegal, and I honestly can't tell which without deep research." "Marcus says it's airtight," Elena offered, handing over the manila folder. "That his attorneys reviewed everything." Sarah studied the contract with the focused intensity of a surgeon examining an X-ray. After several minutes, she looked up, her expression grave. "He's not entirely wrong. The language is careful. It never explicitly refers to selling a child. That would be illegal under federal and state anti-trafficking laws." Instead, it frames everything as a genetic material and gestational services agreement. You would be compensated, theoretically, for carrying genetic material that technically belongs to both you and Marcus to term, then transferring custody to parties who've paid for the service. "But I'm not being compensated," Elena said. "The money goes entirely to Marcus." Which is where this gets interesting from a legal standpoint. Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind clearly racing through precedents and statutes. If you were a party to the contract and agreed to be a gestational carrier for compensation, there's legal framework for that. But you're not a party. Marcus signed this unilaterally, which means he essentially contracted your body and reproductive capacity without your consent. That's where we have leverage. Hope flickered in Elena's chest, tentative and fragile. "So I can fight this?" "You can fight it," Sarah confirmed. "But you need to understand what you're up against. Marcus has resources, connections, and apparently no moral qualms about using them. He'll argue that as your husband, he had the legal right to make joint decisions about family planning. He'll claim you were aware of the arrangement, that you consented implicitly, that you're only objecting now because of the divorce." He'll make this about contract law and property rights, and he'll fight dirty. Elena thought of Marcus's face last night, cold and calculating even in the moment their marriage ended. "I know," she said quietly, "but I don't have a choice. I can't give up this baby." Sarah studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the sense of being evaluated, assessed for the strength to survive what was coming. Whatever Sarah saw must have satisfied her because she nodded and pulled out a legal pad. "Then we need to move fast. First, we file for divorce immediately and include an emergency motion for exclusive custody of the unborn child. Second, we file a separate lawsuit against Marcus for fraud, breach of marital trust, and attempting to contract your reproductive rights without consent. Third, and this is crucial, we need to notify GeneTech Solutions and the Way family that the contract is void due to lack of informed consent from all necessary parties." "Won't that trigger the breach clause?" Elena asked. "The $9 million in damages?" It will. But here's the thing. If we can prove the contract was illegal from the start, the penalty clause is unenforceable. And even if we can't prove that conclusively, no judge is going to force a woman to give up her baby to satisfy a debt, especially not when that debt arose from a contract she never agreed to. Sarah paused, her expression softening. But I won't lie to you, Elena. This will be brutal. Marcus will try to destroy your credibility, your character, everything. He'll paint you as unstable, manipulative, willing to say anything to get out of an obligation. Are you prepared for that? Elena thought of the child growing inside her, cells dividing in the darkness, becoming something miraculous and irreplaceable. She thought of her grandmother, who'd once walked away from a profitable business partnership because the partner suggested cutting corners that would hurt their workers. She thought of the woman she wanted to be, the mother she wanted to become. Yes, she said, I'm prepared. The legal machinery began moving with terrifying speed. By Friday afternoon, Marcus had been served with divorce papers and the emergency custody motion. By Monday morning, Elena received his response, a counter motion seeking full custody of the unborn child on the grounds that she was emotionally unstable and a flight risk, accompanied by a lawsuit for intentional interference with a valid business contract. Sarah had warned her, but seeing it in black and white, seeing Marcus's attorneys argue that she was unfit, that she was damaging his business relationships, that she owed him damages for maliciously sabotaging a legitimate agreement, still felt like being struck. They met in Sarah's office to review the filings, and Elena could barely focus on the words. Everything felt surreal, like watching her life become a legal drama where she was both plaintiff and defendant, victim and accused. He's claiming I knew about the contract, Elena said, pointing to a paragraph that made her stomach turn. That I agreed to it verbally and am only objecting now because of buyer's remorse regarding the marriage? It's a lie, Sarah said bluntly. But it's a lie that's hard to disprove. There are no witnesses to your private conversations, no paper trail of you objecting. From a legal standpoint, it becomes he said, she said, and Marcus is betting that his credibility as a successful CEO will outweigh yours as a soon-to-be ex-wife with no independent income. The truth of Elena's financial dependence hit her then with full force. She'd given up her job as a museum curator 3 years ago when they married, at Marcus's suggestion. We don't need the money, he'd said, and I need a partner who can attend events with me, who can be flexible with travel. She'd agreed, seduced by the romance of it, by the idea of being chosen, being valued enough that her presence mattered more than her paycheck. Now she saw it for what it had been, another strategic move, another way to control, to make her dependent, to ensure she had no leverage if things fell apart. I have nothing, Elena said quietly. No job, no income, no resources to fight this. The credit cards are all in his name. The bank accounts are joint, but he controls them. Even the car I drove was registered to his company. You have something more important, Sarah countered. You have the truth, and you have the law on your side, even if Marcus thinks he can buy his way around it. She pulled out another document, this one several pages long. I've been doing research, consulting with specialists in reproductive law and bioethics. What Marcus did isn't just morally wrong, it may actually be criminal. Elena looked up sharply. Criminal how? There's a federal statute called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It prohibits, among other things, the recruitment, harboring, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through force, fraud, or coercion. Now, courts have traditionally interpreted this in the context of sex trafficking or forced labor. But there's an argument, a good argument, that what Marcus did falls under the fraud or coercion provision. He defrauded you into providing gestational services without your knowledge or consent. Hope and fear warred in Elena's chest. If that's true, if he's actually violated federal law, wouldn't he go to prison? Potentially, though more likely he'd face civil penalties, fines, and permanent damage to his business reputation, which, for someone like Marcus, might be worse than prison. Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. But here's what matters for you. If we can make a credible argument that his contract violated federal law, it becomes void regardless of what his attorneys claim about property rights or marital privilege. The penalty clause disappears. Your obligation disappears. Everything disappears except what should have mattered from the beginning. Your right to choose what happens to your body and your child. For the first time since finding the contract, Elena felt something other than fear. She felt the possibility of winning, of not just surviving this, but actually emerging with her integrity intact and her child safe. What do we need to do? She asked. First, we need evidence that you didn't know about the contract before last Tuesday. Emails, texts, any communication that shows your surprise or Marcus's secrecy. Second, we need to build a narrative about your relationship that demonstrates a pattern of control and deception. And third, Sarah hesitated, then continued, we need you to be prepared to be very public about this. This kind of case, if we push the criminal angle, will attract media attention. Lots of it. Your privacy will be destroyed. Elena thought about this, about seeing her face on news websites, about strangers dissecting her marriage and her choices. The old Elena, the one who'd valued privacy and appearances, would have balked at the exposure. But the old Elena was gone, burned away in the revelation of what her husband had done. I don't care about privacy anymore, she said. I care about protecting this child. If going public helps do that, then that's what we'll do. Sarah smiled, and it was the smile of a warrior recognizing a fellow fighter. Good, because we're about to start a war, and wars are won by whoever's willing to fight harder and longer. Marcus has money and power. But you have something he gave up a long time ago. You have a cause worth fighting for. The story broke on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after Elena had walked out of the penthouse. Sarah had carefully leaked it to a journalist known for covering reproductive rights issues, framing it as a cautionary tale about wealth, technology, and the commodification of human life. By noon, it was trending on social media. By evening, every major news outlet was covering it. CEO accused of selling unborn child without wife's consent, read the headlines. Billionaire's baby contract sparks debate over reproductive rights. Elena watched it unfold from Sarah's office, her phone buzzing incessantly with calls from reporters, friends she hadn't spoken to in years, and family members who'd seen the news and were calling in shock or support. She'd turned off the phone eventually, overwhelmed by the sudden invasion of attention. But Sarah was right. The publicity was working. Public opinion was swinging heavily in Elena's favor. Bioethicists were writing op-eds about the dangers of treating children as commodities. Women's rights organizations were rallying to her cause. Even some business leaders were distancing themselves from Marcus, concerned about being associated with such a toxic scandal. Marcus, predictably, had issued a statement through his attorneys claiming the reports were wildly exaggerated and that he and Elena had a private agreement that she's now mischaracterizing for financial gain in divorce proceedings. But the statement rang hollow, especially when investigative journalists began digging into GeneTech Solutions International and uncovered that this wasn't an isolated case. The company had facilitated dozens of similar arrangements with wealthy clients, all operating in legal gray areas that prioritized profit over ethics. By Friday afternoon, federal prosecutors in Manhattan announced they were opening an investigation into GeneTech Solutions for potential violations of anti-trafficking statutes. Marcus's name was mentioned prominently as a client whose arrangements are being reviewed. Elena sat in Sarah's office, watching the press conference on a laptop, and felt the full weight of what they'd set in motion. This wasn't just about her and Marcus anymore. This was about challenging an entire industry that had emerged in the shadows of wealth and technology, an industry that had learned to profit from the desperation of the childless and the opportunism of the unscrupulous. "You've done something remarkable," Sarah said quietly, sitting beside her as the federal prosecutor fielded questions from reporters. "You've turned a personal tragedy into a movement. People are paying attention now. Laws will change because of this." "I just wanted to keep my baby," Elena said, her voice small in the face of what had become a national conversation. "I know. But sometimes personal battles become public ones because they touch something universal. Something that makes people realize the world they've been living in isn't the world they want to live in." Sarah paused, then added gently, "How are you feeling? Really feeling?" Elena considered the question. She was exhausted, certainly. Frightened about what came next. Angry at Marcus for putting her in this position. But underneath all of that, she felt something she hadn't expected. Clarity. "I feel like I'm finally living according to my own values," she said. "For 3 years, I let Marcus define what mattered, what was important, what was worth caring about. Everything was measured in money or status or strategic advantage. But this—" She placed her hand on her stomach, where the child was still too small to feel but growing every day. "This reminded me that some things are sacred. Some things can't be reduced to their market value." Her phone, which she'd turned back on to check messages from her mother, buzzed with a new text. She glanced at the screen and felt her heart stop. It was from Marcus. "We need to talk. Alone. Tonight. Please." The please was what got her. Marcus never said please. Never asked for anything, only demanded or negotiated. The word suggested something had shifted, some crack had formed in his armor of certainty. She showed the text to Sarah, who read it with narrowed eyes. It could be a trap, a way to get you alone and on record saying something he can use against you. Or it could be genuine, Elena said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. Maybe he's finally realizing what he's done. "Do you want to see him?" Elena thought about this, about the man she'd married and the man he'd become, or had always been. Part of her wanted to refuse, to let the lawyers handle everything, to never have to look at his face again. But another part, the part that had once loved him or thought she did, needed closure, needed to understand how a person could become so lost that they'd sell their own child. "Yes," she said finally, "but somewhere public. And I want you there, nearby, in case things go wrong." Sarah nodded. "I'll set it up. Coffee shop tomorrow morning. I'll be at the next table over. If things get ugly, I'll intervene." That night, Elena lay in her hotel room. She'd upgraded to a better one, using money Sarah had helped her access from the joint accounts before Marcus could freeze them, and tried to imagine what Marcus would say. Would he apologize? Would he try to justify himself? Would he reveal some hidden layer of humanity she'd missed? Or would he simply make one more offer, one more negotiation, one more attempt to solve a moral crisis with money and leverage? She thought of her grandmother again, of the stories about standing firm even when it cost everything. "The test of character," her grandmother had said once, "isn't what you do when everyone's watching. It's what you do when you think no one will ever know." Marcus had failed that test. He'd made choices in private that revealed the hollowness at his core. And now, in the harsh light of public scrutiny, he would have to live with the consequences. But tomorrow, before the lawyers and judges and jury of public opinion rendered their final verdict, she would give him one chance to be human again. One chance to look her in the eye and explain how a person could lose their soul so completely that they'd trade their child for $3 million. Outside her window, the city hummed with its endless energy. Millions of people living their private dramas, making their own choices between integrity and expedience. Elena placed her hand on her stomach and made a silent promise. Whatever happened tomorrow, whatever Marcus said or didn't say, she would never forget what mattered. She would never forget that some things, some precious, irreplaceable things, were worth more than all the money in Manhattan. She would never forget that the child she carried was not a commodity, not an asset, not a line item in a contract. They were a miracle, a possibility, a future, and she would fight for that future with everything she had. The coffee shop Sarah had chosen was in the West Village, a neighborhood Marcus rarely visited because it lacked the aggressive polish of his usual haunts. It was the kind of place where students studied for exams and freelancers worked on laptops, where the baristas knew regulars by name and the art on the walls was actually for sale by local artists. Elena arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table by the window where morning light streamed through and made everything feel less heavy. Sarah sat 3 tables over, ostensibly reading a newspaper, but actually watching everything with the vigilance of a bodyguard. Marcus arrived exactly on time. Of course he did, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, but looking somehow diminished in it, as if the fabric no longer fit quite right. His face was drawn, his eyes carrying shadows that suggested he'd been sleeping as poorly as she had. He sat down across from her without ordering anything, without the usual performance of checking his phone or adjusting his cufflinks. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small table. 2 people who'd once promised forever and now couldn't imagine even another hour together. "Thank you for coming," he said finally, and his voice was different, quieter, stripped of its usual commanding tone. "I wasn't sure you would." "I almost didn't," Elena admitted. "But I needed to understand. I needed to hear you explain how this happened, how you became someone who could do what you did." Marcus looked down at his hands, those hands that had signed the contract, that had shaken hands with the Weiss, that had once held hers and made promises he'd already forgotten. "I don't have an explanation that will satisfy you. I don't think I have an explanation that satisfies me. Try anyway." He took a breath, and when he spoke, it was with a rawness she'd never heard from him before. "When I was building the company, I used to have these moments of doubt. Late at night, after everyone else had gone home, I'd sit in my office and wonder if I was doing the right thing, if the sacrifices were worth it, if the person I was becoming was someone I could live with. And," Elena prompted when he paused, "and I learned to silence those doubts." I told myself that sentiment was weakness, that ethics were just another word for inefficiency, that the only thing that mattered was winning. And it worked. Every time I made the hard choice, the ruthless choice, the choice that prioritized profit over people, I succeeded. The company grew, my wealth grew, my power grew, and eventually I stopped hearing the doubts altogether. He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before, regret, or perhaps just exhaustion with the person he'd created. "The contract with Genetech wasn't the first time I crossed a line, Elena. It was just the first time the line was visible enough that I couldn't pretend it wasn't there. I'd been compromising my humanity in smaller ways for years. This was just the logical endpoint of that trajectory." "You sold our child," Elena said, needing him to speak the words plainly, without euphemism or corporate language. "You looked at the possibility of creating life together and saw only a financial opportunity." "Yes." The word came out like a confession, like an admission of guilt in a courtroom. "And I didn't even realize how monstrous that was until I saw your face that night, until I watched you understand what I'd done. In that moment, I saw myself through your eyes, and I couldn't recognize the person looking back." Elena felt tears threatening, but refused to let them fall. "Why are you telling me this? Is this supposed to make me forgive you? Feel sorry for you?" "No." Marcus shook his head. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it." "I'm telling you this because you deserve an honest answer, and because—" his voice cracked slightly, "because I need you to know that the man who sold your baby wasn't the man I wanted to be. He was just the man I became when I stopped paying attention to who I was becoming." Silence settled between them, heavy with the weight of 3 years of marriage and all the ways it had failed. Elena thought of the young man who'd quoted Rilke, who'd talked about building something meaningful, and wondered if he'd ever really existed or if he'd just been a performance, a pitch, another strategic move. "The federal investigation," she said finally. "What's going to happen to you?" "I'll probably face charges, civil penalties, maybe criminal ones depending on what the prosecutors find at Genetech. My business relationships are already collapsing. The board is discussing removing me as CEO," he said this flatly, without the panic she'd expected. "My attorney thinks I can negotiate a settlement that avoids prison time, but my reputation is finished. Everything I built is crumbling." "Good," Elena said, and meant it. "You should lose everything. You should face consequences for what you did." "I know." Marcus met her eyes steadily. and I'm not here to ask you to help me avoid those consequences. I'm here to tell you that I'm dropping all legal claims to the child. I'm withdrawing my custody motion. I'm signing whatever documents your attorney needs to terminate my parental rights. You win, Elena. The baby is yours. She'd expected to feel triumph at these words, vindication, relief. Instead, she felt only sadness, for the marriage that had failed, for the man who'd lost himself, for all the ways their story could have been different if either of them had been braver, or wiser, or more honest. I was never fighting to win, she said quietly. I was fighting to protect my child from becoming a commodity in a world that's already too comfortable treating people as products. I understand that now. Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a document, folded and official-looking. This is a termination of parental rights agreement. It's already notarized and witnessed. I signed it this morning. You just need to add your signature and file it with the court. Elena took the document with trembling hands, scanned the legalese, and saw that it was genuine. Marcus was relinquishing all claims, all rights, all connections to the child she carried. In the eyes of the law, he would be nothing to them. Not a father, not a guardian, not even a name on a birth certificate. What will you do? She asked, surprising herself with the question. After all this? I don't know. For the first time in their entire marriage, Marcus Thorne looked uncertain, unmoored, stripped of the confidence that had defined him. Maybe I'll rebuild. Maybe I'll do something different entirely. Maybe I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone I'm not ashamed of. He stood, preparing to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Elena, I hope you raise our child to be nothing like me. Teach them that some things matter more than money. That integrity isn't weakness. That being human means sometimes choosing the harder path because it's the right one. He left before she could respond, walking out of the coffee shop and into the bright morning, just another man in an expensive suit navigating the streets of a city that had made him rich but had cost him everything that mattered. Elena sat alone at the table, the document in her hands, and felt the full weight of what had just happened. She'd won. Marcus had surrendered completely. The child she carried was hers to raise, to love, to protect from the machinery of commerce that had nearly consumed them both. Sarah appeared at her side, having watched the entire exchange. Are you okay? I don't know, Elena said honestly. I thought I'd feel different. Victorious, maybe, but I just feel sad. For him, for us, for how lost a person can become when they stop asking if they should do something and only ask if they can. That's because you're a good person, Sarah said gently. You can recognize someone's humanity even when they've nearly lost it themselves. Elena folded the document carefully and placed it in her purse. What happens now? Legally, I mean. Now we file this with the court, and you move forward with the divorce proceedings. The federal investigation into Genetech will continue, but without Marcus fighting you, there's no custody battle. You're free, Elena. You and your baby are free. 3 months later, Elena stood in the doorway of a small apartment in Park Slope, Brooklyn. It wasn't much, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a brownstone with creaky floors and radiators that clanged in the morning, but it was hers, truly hers, paid for with the divorce settlement Sarah had negotiated, the one that had given Elena enough to start over without being dependent on anyone. She'd furnished it simply: a comfortable couch from a consignment shop, a dining table made by a local craftsman, bookshelves filled with volumes she'd been meaning to read for years, but never had time for during her marriage. The bedroom had become a nursery, painted a soft sage green, with a crib her mother had driven down from Vermont and curtains her sister had sewn. The apartment had a small balcony that overlooked a tree-lined street, and Elena had filled it with plants, tomatoes, herbs, flowers that bloomed in defiant bursts of color. Every morning, she'd stand there with her coffee, watching the neighborhood wake up, feeling the child move inside her with increasingly vigorous kicks. She'd gotten a job at a small gallery in Chelsea, nothing as prestigious as her old position at the museum, but honest work that allowed her to be around art again, to remember what she'd loved before Marcus had convinced her to give it all up. Her colleagues were kind, her hours were reasonable, and no one expected her to attend mandatory networking events or smile through business dinners where deals mattered more than people. Her pregnancy was progressing normally. She'd found an excellent OB/GYN who specialized in supporting women through complicated circumstances, who never asked intrusive questions about the father but always made sure Elena felt supported and informed. The sonograms showed a healthy baby, growing steadily, their heartbeats strong and regular, like a promise being kept. Elena had started attending a support group for single mothers, women who'd found themselves raising children alone for 100 different reasons: divorce, death, abandonment, choice. They met Thursday evenings in a community center basement, drinking bad coffee and sharing stories that ranged from heartbreaking to hilarious. All of them united by the fierce determination to give their children what they needed, even when the world seemed designed to make that difficult. She'd made friends there, real friends, not the transactional relationships of Marcus's social circle, where every conversation was an opportunity to advance or a threat to defend against. Women who called her just to check in, who offered to help set up the nursery, who showed up with casseroles and baby clothes and the kind of practical support that meant more than any expensive gift. One evening, sitting on her balcony as the sun set over Brooklyn, Elena's phone rang. She almost didn't answer when she saw the number was blocked, but something made her pick up. "Elena?" The voice was familiar, but transformed by distance or time or circumstance. "It's Marcus." Her first instinct was to hang up, to refuse to engage, to maintain the boundaries she'd so carefully constructed. But curiosity won out. "Why are you calling?" "I wanted to tell you something. I needed you to know." He sounded different than he had in the coffee shop months ago, lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. "The federal investigation wrapped up last week. GeneTech Solutions has been shut down permanently. The executives are facing criminal charges, and I accepted a plea deal, 5 years probation, community service, and a permanent ban from serving as an executive officer in any publicly traded company." "Congratulations on avoiding prison," Elena said, unable to keep the edge from her voice. "That's not why I'm calling." Marcus paused, and she heard something that might have been a breath or might have been a laugh. "I'm calling to tell you that I've been working with the prosecutors to identify all the other couples who were caught up in GeneTech's schemes. We've been contacting them, offering support, connecting them with attorneys, trying to undo some of the damage." Elena felt her anger softening despite herself. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. And because, he hesitated, Because I spent so many years not doing the right thing that I need to practice. I need to remember what it feels like to make choices that aren't about profit or advantage or winning. She thought about this, about the man Marcus had been, and the man he might become if he kept practicing, kept choosing differently. "I hope it works out for you," she said, and found that she meant it. "How are you?" Marcus asked, his voice careful, as if he knew he no longer had the right to ask, but couldn't help himself. "How's the baby?" "We're good, healthy, strong." Elena placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the flutter of movement that had become so familiar. "We're going to be okay. I know you will be." There was something final in his tone, something that suggested this call was a kind of goodbye. "You were always the strong one, Elena. I just couldn't see it because I was too busy measuring strength in all the wrong ways." After they hung up, Elena sat on her balcony until the stars emerged, thinking about redemption and transformation, about the possibility that people could change even after they'd made terrible choices. She didn't know if Marcus would truly become someone better, didn't know if his current remorse would last or fade once the legal consequences were behind him. But she knew that she had changed, that the woman who'd walked out of that penthouse 6 months ago was not the same woman sitting here now, feeling her child move inside her, building a life based on her own values rather than someone else's vision. The contraction started on a Tuesday morning in late spring, when the trees on her street were heavy with new leaves and the world felt impossibly alive. Elena's mother drove her to the hospital, talking calmly about breathing and timing, while Elena gripped the door handle and tried to remember everything she'd learned in birthing classes. Labor was long and hard, and nothing like the serene experience the pregnancy books had promised. But when they finally placed her daughter in her arms, pink and wrinkled and screaming with the fury of someone who'd just been forced from warmth into light, Elena felt something shift in her chest, some fundamental reorganization of her priorities and fears and understanding of love. "She's perfect," her mother whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Absolutely perfect." Elena looked down at her daughter's face, at the tiny fists waving in protest, at eyes that would eventually decide what color they wanted to be, but for now were dark and searching. She thought of Marcus briefly, wondered if he knew he had a daughter, if he ever thought about what he'd given up. But mostly, she thought about the future, about first steps and first words, about scraped knees and hurt feelings, about teaching this small person to navigate a world that would sometimes be cruel, but could also be beautiful beyond measure. "Her name is Grace," Elena said, surprising herself because she hadn't decided until this moment. "Grace Elizabeth Morrison." Her mother smiled. "After your grandmother." "After my grandmother," Elena confirmed. Grace, the grandmother who'd taught her that integrity mattered more than profit, that some lines couldn't be crossed without losing yourself, that the measure of a life wasn't what you accumulated, but what you gave freely. The next few days passed in a blur of feedings and diaper changes, and learning to interpret different types of cries. Elena's sister came to visit, bringing food and offers to hold the baby while Elena slept. The women from her support group stopped by with gifts and encouragement. Sarah sent flowers and a card that read, "You did it. You won the fight that mattered." On Grace's 5th day of life, Elena sat in her apartment's small nursery, rocking her daughter while the early morning light turned everything soft and golden. Grace had finally fallen asleep after an hour of fussing, her tiny mouth still making sucking motions even in dreams. Elena thought about everything that had led to this moment, the marriage that had failed, the contract that had nearly destroyed her, the legal battle that had changed laws and shut down a corrupt industry. She thought about Marcus and wondered if he was somewhere becoming the person he'd claimed he wanted to be. She thought about the Wei family in Singapore, who'd paid $3 million for a child they would never receive, and hoped they'd find another path to parenthood that didn't require commodifying human life. But mostly, she thought about Grace, about the person she would become, about the values Elena would teach her. She would raise her daughter to know that people weren't products, that love couldn't be reduced to transactions, that some things, the most important things, existed beyond the reach of money or power or calculated advantage. She would teach her about her grandmother, about choosing integrity even when it cost everything. She would tell her, eventually, about the circumstances of her birth, about the contract and the battle, and the price of standing firm against a world that wanted to commodify what should remain sacred. But she would also teach her about redemption, about the possibility that people could change, that mistakes didn't have to define a whole life. She would teach her to be strong, but also compassionate, fierce, but also forgiving, to fight for what mattered, while remembering that even those who opposed her were human beings capable of transformation. As Grace slept in her arms, Elena looked out the window at the neighborhood coming alive. People walking dogs, joggers passing by, the coffee shop on the corner opening its doors to welcome the day. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary part of Brooklyn, filled with ordinary people living their ordinary lives. But for Elena, it felt extraordinary. This moment, this apartment, this child sleeping peacefully in her arms, it represented everything she'd fought for, everything she'd risked, everything she'd chosen when choosing would have been easier to surrender. She thought of a line from Rilke, the poet Marcus had once quoted, when he was still pretending to be someone deeper than he was. Perhaps all the dragons in our lives are princesses who are only waiting to see us act, just once, with beauty and courage. Marcus had been her dragon, not in the sense of being evil, but in the sense of being the obstacle she'd needed to overcome to discover who she truly was. And in fighting him, in refusing to let him reduce her child to a commodity, she'd found her own beauty and courage. She'd found her strength. Grace stirred in her arms, made a small sound, then settled back into sleep. Elena kissed her daughter's forehead, breathed in that distinctive newborn smell that was somehow both familiar and brand new, and made a silent promise. "I will teach you to be brave," she whispered. "I will teach you that some things are worth fighting for. I will teach you that love isn't a transaction, that people aren't products, that the most valuable things in this world are the things that can't be bought or sold." She paused, then added, "And I will teach you that, even when people lose their way, even when they make terrible choices, they can sometimes find their way back to who they're supposed to be. Because everyone deserves a chance at redemption. Everyone deserves a chance to become someone better than they were." Outside, the sun climbed higher, and the day unfolded with all its ordinary miracles. Elena sat in her nursery with her daughter, feeling the weight of responsibility and the joy of possibility in equal measure. She didn't know what the future would hold, what challenges Grace would face, what choices she would make, what person she would become. But she knew that her daughter would be raised with love, with integrity, with the understanding that she was precious not because of what she could produce or achieve or become, but simply because she existed, because she was human, because she was Grace. And in a world that increasingly measured worth in dollars and influence and market value, that was perhaps the most radical gift Elena could give her child, the knowledge that her value was inherent, inalienable, and infinite, the knowledge that she was not a commodity. She was a miracle, and she was loved.